As health promoters, one of the things you might encounter, and quite often actually, is individuals that have obesity. So in this unit, I want to give you a good overview of what obesity is and some of the things you need to keep in mind if you are interacting with or helping individuals with obesity. Some of the main messages I do want to get across, though, is to always approach people with a human-based approach and a kindness-based approach, and to minimize judgments, because that often is a huge barrier to people wanting to work with someone and for people actually improving these different health effects that you might want them to improve in. Okay, so just to get us started, obesity is defined as abnormal or excessive fat accumulation which compromises health. Right now, there is no perfect way of measuring this. You probably know that there's many issues with using body mass index to measure adiposity. For instance, it can't differentiate between fat mass and lean mass, but it also doesn't necessarily tell us the physiological or mental effects that excess weight has on a person. So there's a lot of debates on how we actually classify obesity, and we want to properly identify it so we can use the right approach. Okay. Something I won't talk about this unit, but is important to mention, is there's something called the Edmonton staging system, which can actually better help identify individuals with obesity that perhaps need more help. Okay. Obesity has classically been looked at as a risk factor for disease, and in fact it is. There are a plethora of comorbidities that obesity is associated with, like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and certain forms of cancer. But it's important to realize that obesity is a disease itself. It is a chronic disease that has a variety of causes, from the genetic to the very distal environmental as well. And once an individual has obesity, the way that changes the body is often in a way that, you know, you can lose weight, but it's always there's some effects that tend to stick around. That when the body gains a lot of fat mass, it wants to keep that fat mass. And that's why it's so difficult for people to lose an excessive amount of weight and keep that off as well. Okay, so like I mentioned, obesity is a disease. It has been declared a chronic disease by the Canadian Medical Association, the American Medical Association, and it's important to declare it as a disease, because when it's declared a disease, then ideally we start treating it with more importance. And we don't just look at it as kind of a lifestyle decision, because it's not a lifestyle decision. Okay, it's an effect, yes, of lifestyle choices, but it's also an effect of physiological and environmental factors as well. Okay, so please know that it's both a risk factor and a disease. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how obesity develops from, let's say, more of a simplistic reductionist view, and then we'll go out from there, we'll increase our frame from there. When energy intake is higher than energy expenditure, doesn't matter which nutrient, which energy yielding nutrient is higher, be it proteins, carbs, or lipids, and alcohol, which isn't a nutrient but nonetheless has energy. Excess energy, when it's above the body's needs, is already lipids, or it's mostly converted into lipids. And that excess lipid is stored within adipose tissue, within our adipocytes. And as adipocytes gain fat mass, they increase in both size and number. And this increase in fat mass is what leads to an increase in weight gain. Okay? And just a little bit more about those adipocytes. This is what they look like under a microscope. They look like just like empty spaces. And that's because when we prepare slides, we use a fat wash, which like wipes away the lipids that are found in there, so they look empty. Okay, so all those kind of holes, what's in those holes are a fat vacuole, and that's where we store the lipids. Okay, for a long time, we kind of just didn't pay attention to adipose tissue because we thought, okay, that's where we store fat. Cool, that's it. But what we've realized, what we've learned since the mid-90s is that adipocytes actually interact with the rest of the body. They are dynamic tissue. They release something called adipokines, a type of cytokine that's released by adipocytes. And these adipokines, like leptin, which you might be familiar with, are secreted by adipocytes, travel through the blood, and then have many targets throughout the body. In health, below a certain level of fat mass, adipokine secretion promotes health. It promotes less inflammation and overall better health. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with having fat tissue. We need fat tissue, absolutely, for a whole slew of reasons. But the issue with obesity is that beyond a certain threshold of fat mass, adipokine secretion changes. And this change in adipokine secretion increases levels of inflammation in the body and increases the risk of disease as well. Okay, so obesity is often called a state of low-grade inflammation. And this low-grade inflammation, this higher kind of immune response, higher than normal immune response that we see, is associated with things like insulin resistance, which increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. We believe the link between obesity and its comorbidities has to do with that increase in low-grade inflammation. Okay, so now that we know that what I just talked about is a classification of obesity and its effect on the body as something called sick fat disease, also known as adiposopathy. Okay, so sick fat disease, this is when adipokine secretion shifts to promote inflammation and we have all these comorbidities. But obesity affects the body also due to that extra mass that person is carrying. That extra weight the person carries increases the amount of strain on the body. It promotes mechanical issues like joint pain, like osteoarthritis, like tissue friction. And what breaks my heart about that is that if someone has that, then of course that can affect their ability to exercise, right? Or that could be very painful for them to move their body and to do things that can actually improve the condition that they have. So we actually saw this map last week with Diane's lecture, and this is something called the Foresight Map of Obesity, which came out in 2007. And this map looks at the complex causes of obesity, all the different evidence-based, all these little boxes here are all the different evidence-based factors that are associated with an increase in fat mass. Okay, and you'll notice that these causes of obesity range from the more kind of internal central engine driven by individual factors like physiology, food consumption, and individual physical activity and psychology, but also distal factors like the environment we live in and how, for instance, it promotes physical activity or how it does or doesn't promote food consumption. Okay, so have a read through the readings from this week because it's going to go over, I want you to understand what each of these things mean: social psychology, individual psychology. And the other main message I want you to get from this particular map, if I go to the full map, here's the full map, is that nothing occurs in isolation. And when I actually zoom in, right? So remember, it depends on the frame we're using. When I zoom in, I start to understand these relationships a little bit more. And one relationship I really want to focus on is that relationship of degree of primary appetite control. You'll notice a lot of inputs into that system. Okay? And that's because a lot of different things affect that, and what's one of the main governing areas that increases the risk of obesity. It's not the only one, of course not. It's a complex disease, but it's one of the main ones that we're going to focus on in the coming slides. Okay? So some key messages of the Foresight Map: causes of obesity are complex, interrelated, and deal from the physiological, the environmental, and the psychological. Okay? There is no single intervention that is always going to work at the individual level, or definitely not at the population level. Okay? Often we need coordinated efforts at multiple levels for population level impact. And usually with an individual, we often have to kind of understand their own set of causal factors that are increasing their own risk. Sure, they eat too much, we could say, but why are they eating so much? Is it the environment they live in? Is it how their parents taught them? Is it that they're eating because of emotional issues? Okay. And yeah, physical activity, not exercising enough, impacts someone's risk for obesity, but why aren't they being active? Do they have pain? Do they have a negative past history with physical activity? Do they not know where to start? Right? Do they not know how to plan a sustainable program for themselves? Right? Again, that's why we work with people to figure out what's going to work best for them. Okay? And like we said, keep saying, is the cause of obesity, they range from these proximal levels to more distal levels. A couple other key messages of the Foresight Map is that lifestyle intervention can make a difference. Yeah, sure. Okay. However, I really recommend not telling people to just eat less and exercise more, because that kind of advice doesn't get us anywhere. But we can work with someone to figure out what's going to work best for them. However, it's important to realize that lifestyle intervention isn't enough for some people. Some individuals need more significant interventions in order to make a difference in their size and in their quality of life too. So some individuals may also need pharmacotherapy, or they might need bariatric strategies as well, like bariatric surgery. Okay. Another main message that I really want to say about obesity is that there is a strong genetic link with obesity. And I know that when I say something like this, people are like, oh, you're just trying to make excuses. That's often when you see in like comment boards when you talk about the genetic links between obesity, but like it's significant and it's very clearly established in the research. Some of the earliest evidence of the genetic link with obesity are twin studies, where we found that monozygotic twins, those that are identical twins, those that share the same genes, they tend to have very similar BMIs and body fat distribution patterns. Okay. However, dizygotic twins, those that have similar but different genetic makeup, and those that share the same environment, those tend to have different body sizes and shapes and are more likely to have a BMI that's not well correlated. Okay. Newer genetic studies, in particular something called genome-wide association studies, have really highlighted that one of the main areas that is impacted in obesity is our appetite regulation center. Okay, so you probably know as a third-year BBK student that our hypothalamus, that's the drive center, that's the homeostasis center, and it's also our appetite center. Okay, and this little overview right here gives you a sense of how appetite is regulated in the hypothalamus. You do not need to memorize this. You will have to know it if you take my BPK 417 class. But it just kind of shows that we have an appetite pathway and a satiety pathway, and there's interactions between these two pathways within the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is also constantly receiving input from other parts of the body. So I said that there was genetic evidence to support that appetite regulation was one of the main things that is maybe off in individuals with obesity. Well, in particular, something called genome-wide association studies that have basically looked at the genomes of individuals with obesity compared to the genomes of individuals that don't have obesity. And they found that individuals with obesity are more likely to have genetic changes, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, in and around genes that are associated with appetite. So, and as someone who definitely has dealt with obesity in her life, I can tell you, and if you talk to individuals with obesity, that I couldn't explain to you why I just couldn't stop eating sometimes, or why I was always hungry. And if you've never dealt with that yourself, you might look at someone with obesity and be like, well, just eat less. It's obvious, come on. And it is obvious to someone that has normal appetite regulation. But to someone where that might be changed for instance, genetic or endocrine reasons, it doesn't actually even make sense why that appetite seems so perturbed. Okay, so it's important to understand that for some people, it's really easy to regulate appetite, and for other people, it's very, very difficult. Okay, so like I said, the appetite center in our hypothalamus receives input from a whole slew of different areas. There are internal signals to our hypothalamic appetite center, including from adipose tissue, our digestive tract like CCK and GLP-1, and our microbiome. We know that the bacteria in our gut has an impact on our appetite as well, okay? But also our emotions are strongly connected. Our emotional centers, our limbic system is strongly connected with our appetite center. Okay, as is our prefrontal cortex. And our prefrontal cortex, because everything in the brain is connected, is also connected with more of the emotional parts of our brain. And these can all create a situation that increases or decreases a person's appetite. And of course, our food environment, which we interpret through what we see and smell, and then kind of goes through our thinking brain or our prefrontal cortex, links it to emotion and memory. All of these impact our appetite center as well. So appetite is super complex. And then again, this reminds us that we need to work with our individuals to figure out, why perhaps are they having a hard time managing their appetite, or where can we make a difference? Can we change their food environment? Can we change some of the foods they're eating that in order to promote satiety? Do we have to kind of fix their gut a little bit by promoting lower levels of stress or increased levels of physical activity or promoting a high fiber diet? Is it emotions that are promoting overeating? Is it limiting thoughts and beliefs? Each person is different, and I really want you guys to understand that obesity is not simple. The basics of it, food intake versus energy expenditure, that's kind of simple. But the reasons why we eat so much and don't exercise enough are very different for each individual. So I hope by the end of this section, you have an understanding more, and hopefully a little bit more compassion and understanding of obesity as a complex system and the need to approach it as a disease with a non-judgmental and open lens.